Guests sit over there. This table's for family, my dad commanded, indicating a wobbly chair beside the trash can. Everyone chuckled while I ate alone. Then the cake came out, and so did the bill. $2,790. The server handed it to me. I just stood up and proclaimed, "You might want to try the family table instead." I, 32M, should have seen it coming the moment I walked into that upscale restaurant and spotted my father's smug expression. The place was packed with extended family I barely recognized anymore, all gathered around an enormous table that could easily seat 20. My stepmother had orchestrated this whole elaborate celebration for my father's 65th birthday, and somehow I'd been foolish enough to think things might be different this time. The hostess led me toward the main table where everyone was already seated, laughing and sharing appetizers. I felt a brief moment of hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally be welcomed back into the fold after years of being treated like an outsider. That hope died instantly when my father looked up and saw me approaching. My father gestured dismissively toward a tiny, rickety table shoved into the corner next to the service station, where servers dumped dirty dishes and the trash can overflowed with discarded napkins. He announced loudly that guests should sit over there, making it clear that this table was reserved for family only. The emphasis he put on the word family cut through me like a blade, and the way everyone turned to stare at me made my cheeks burn with humiliation. My stepmother giggled behind her hand, clearly delighted by the spectacle. My half-siblings exchanged knowing glances, as if this was exactly what they'd expected to happen. Even my elderly aunt, who used to sneak me cookies when I was little, avoided eye contact and focused intently on her breadstick. I stood there for a moment, frozen by the familiar sting of rejection. This was the same treatment I'd endured for the past 15 years, ever since my father remarried and started his new real family. I'd become nothing more than an obligation, a reminder of his first marriage that he clearly wished he could erase entirely. But I was here now, and walking away would only give them more ammunition to use against me later. I could already hear my stepmother telling her friends about how I couldn't even handle a simple family dinner, how I was always causing drama and making everything about myself. So I made my way to the wobbly table in the corner, trying to maintain whatever dignity I had left. The chair was so unsteady that every time I moved, it threatened to dump me onto the floor. The noise from the kitchen was overwhelming, with servers constantly brushing past me and the smell of garbage wafting up every few minutes. The server, a young woman who looked genuinely sorry for me, approached my isolated table and asked what I'd like to drink. I could see her glancing between me and the large family table, clearly confused by the arrangement, but too professional to comment. I ordered a beer and tried to pretend that sitting alone in a restaurant full of my own relatives was perfectly normal. From my corner, I watched the main table come alive with conversation and laughter. They passed around photos, shared inside jokes, and made plans for upcoming holidays that I wouldn't be invited to. My father held court at the head of the table, basking in the attention and playing the role of beloved patriarch to perfection. The worst part was how natural it all looked. This wasn't some cruel setup designed specifically to hurt me. This was just how things were now. I'd been so thoroughly excluded from the family dynamic that my presence barely registered as an inconvenience. I was like a piece of furniture they'd forgotten to move. My half-brother, now in his 20s, was regaling everyone with stories from his recent promotion at work. My father beamed with pride, asking detailed questions and bragging about his son's accomplishments to anyone who would listen. I remembered a time when I'd gotten a similar promotion, and my father's response had been a distracted nod and a comment about how I should be grateful just to have a job. The food arrived in waves, elaborate dishes that clearly cost a fortune. Lobster tails, premium steaks, bottles of wine that probably cost more than my monthly rent. At the main table, they were sharing everything family style, passing plates around, and sampling each other's choices. Meanwhile, I'd ordered the most basic pasta dish on the menu, partly because I didn't want to spend too much and partly because I had no appetite anyway. My stepmother kept making theatrical gestures, ensuring that everyone could see her massive diamond ring and her designer dress. She'd positioned herself as the queen of this little kingdom, and my father clearly adored playing the role of her devoted subject. She whispered something in his ear that made him laugh loudly, and I caught him glancing in my direction with obvious satisfaction. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about all the other family events I'd been excluded from over the years. Graduations, weddings, holiday celebrations, always with some excuse about limited space or budget constraints. Yet somehow there was always room for my stepmother's relatives, people who'd only known my father for a few years but were treated with more warmth than his own son. The breaking point came when they brought out the birthday cake. It was a massive, custom-made creation that must have cost several $100s on its own. Everyone gathered around my father as he prepared to blow out the candles, and someone started leading them in a rousing rendition of Happy Birthday. I sat in my corner, invisible and forgotten, watching this celebration of a man who'd systematically erased me from his life. My father made a big show of making a wish before blowing out the candles, and everyone cheered and applauded. He stood up to give a speech about how grateful he was for his wonderful family, how blessed he felt to be surrounded by people who truly cared about him. His eyes swept across the table, acknowledging each person individually, but his gaze skipped right over me as if I didn't exist. Then the server approached with the bill, and everything changed. She walked directly to my table and placed the leather folder in front of me with an apologetic smile. I opened it and nearly choked on my drink. $2,790 for a single dinner. I stared at the number, trying to process what was happening. The server explained quietly that my father had given specific instructions when making the reservation that all charges should be directed to me. He'd apparently told them I was treating everyone to celebrate his special day, and that I'd insisted on handling the entire bill as my gift to him. I looked up at the main table and realized that my father was watching me intently, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. This had been his plan all along. Humiliate me by making me sit alone, then stick me with a bill that would probably wipe out my savings. It was the perfect power play, designed to remind me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. My stepmother was practically vibrating with anticipation, clearly in on the scheme and eager to see how I'd react. My half-siblings were trying to look casual, but I could see them stealing glances in my direction. Even the extended family members seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if I'd make a scene. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to just pay up and slink away, to avoid confrontation, to keep the peace, to maintain the fiction that we were all one big happy family. That's what I'd done for years, absorbed every slight, every insult, every deliberate exclusion, always hoping that if I just tried harder, if I was more accommodating, maybe things would improve. But sitting there in that corner, surrounded by the sounds of kitchen chaos and the smell of garbage, staring at a bill that represented months of careful budgeting, something inside me finally snapped. I stood up slowly, the rickety chair scraping against the floor and drawing everyone's attention. The conversation at the main table died away as all eyes turned to me. My father leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, waiting to see me squirm. Instead, I picked up the bill and walked calmly over to their table. The silence was deafening as I approached, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. But for the first time in years, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do. I looked directly at my father and told him that there seemed to be some confusion about the bill. I explained that since I wasn't family, as he'd made abundantly clear by seating me in the corner like an unwanted guest, I certainly wouldn't be paying for the family's dinner. I placed the bill directly in front of him and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that he might want to try the family table instead, since that's where the people responsible for this celebration were sitting. The look of shock on his face was worth every awkward moment I'd endured that evening. My stepmother's mouth fell open, and I could see her calculating frantically, trying to figure out how they'd cover a nearly $3,000 bill they'd never intended to pay. My father sputtered something about this being inappropriate, about how I was embarrassing myself and everyone else. But I was already walking toward the exit, feeling lighter with every step. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversations and the sound of multiple credit cards being fumbled out of wallets and purses. I didn't look back as I pushed through the restaurant door and stepped into the cool evening air. My phone started buzzing almost immediately with angry texts and voicemails, but I ignored them all. For the first time in 15 years, I'd stood up for myself instead of accepting whatever scraps of dignity they were willing to throw my way. Update 1. The fallout was swift and predictable. My stepmother called me the next morning, her voice shrill with indignation. She demanded to know how I could be so selfish and cruel, ruining my father's birthday celebration and forcing them to scramble to pay a bill they couldn't afford. She reminded me that family was supposed to support each other, conveniently forgetting that I'd been excluded from that family for most of my adult life. My father's message was more calculated, delivered in the disappointed tone he'd perfected over the years. He expressed his shock at my behavior, claiming he'd simply made an innocent mistake about the bill and that my reaction was completely disproportionate. He suggested that I needed to do some serious soul-searching about my priorities and my commitment to family relationships. But the most interesting response came from my half-brother, who sent a short text asking if we could meet for coffee. When we sat down the next afternoon, he surprised me by admitting that he'd always felt uncomfortable with how I was treated, but had never known how to address it. He told me that watching me walk away from that restaurant had been both shocking and somehow liberating. He revealed that the family dynamics had always been more complicated than they appeared on the surface. Our stepmother had spent years systematically poisoning my father against me, feeding him stories about my supposed resentment and lack of respect. She'd positioned herself as the protector of his new family, constantly reinforcing the idea that I was a threat to their happiness and stability. My half-brother also shared something that hit me like a physical blow. He told me that our father had actually wanted to include me more over the years, but our stepmother had convinced him that I preferred to keep my distance. She'd been intercepting some of his attempts to reach out, filtering invitations and communications to maintain the narrative that I was the one choosing to stay away. This revelation was almost harder to process than the years of outright rejection. The idea that some of the exclusion had been manufactured, that there might have been opportunities for connection that were deliberately sabotaged, made me question everything I thought I knew about our family situation. Update 2. 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, my father showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't answer the door, but something about his posture through the peephole looked different, less arrogant, more uncertain than I'd seen him in years. He asked if he could come in, and after a long moment, I stepped aside to let him enter. We sat in my living room in awkward silence before he finally began to speak. He told me that my half-brother had shared some uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics, and that he'd been doing some difficult thinking about his own role in our estrangement. He admitted that he'd allowed my stepmother's influence to cloud his judgment, that he'd chosen the path of least resistance instead of fighting for a relationship with me. He acknowledged that the restaurant incident had been planned, though he claimed it was meant to be a harmless prank rather than the cruel humiliation it had become. But what struck me most was his admission that he'd been afraid. Afraid of confronting the guilt he felt about how his second marriage had affected me, afraid of acknowledging the ways he'd failed as a father, afraid of the messy emotional work required to rebuild our relationship. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He was smart enough to know that years of damage couldn't be undone with a single conversation. Instead, he asked if I'd be willing to consider family therapy, something he'd never suggested before. He said he wanted to understand how we'd gotten to this point and whether there was any possibility of moving forward together. I told him I needed time to think about it. The hurt was still too fresh, the patterns too deeply ingrained for me to simply accept his apology and move on. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to the father I remembered from childhood rather than the stranger he'd become. Update 3. 6 months later, I find myself in a place I never expected to be. My father and I have been attending therapy sessions together, slowly unpacking decades of miscommunication, manipulation, and mutual resentment. It's been brutally difficult work, but also surprisingly healing. My stepmother, predictably, has not taken well to this development. She's become increasingly hostile as my father has started setting boundaries with her and refusing to automatically take her side in family disputes. Their marriage is reportedly quite strained, and she's made it clear that she views my reemergence in my father's life as a direct threat to her position. The extended family has largely split along predictable lines. Some relatives have reached out to express support for my decision to stand up for myself, while others have made it clear that they view me as a troublemaker who destroyed a perfectly nice birthday celebration. I've learned to live with their disapproval. Most surprisingly, my relationship with my half-siblings has improved dramatically. Without the constant influence of their mother poisoning the well, we've discovered that we actually have quite a bit in common. My half-sister recently confided that she'd always admired my independence, but had been discouraged from expressing any positive feelings about me. The restaurant bill, incidentally, was eventually split among the family members who'd actually enjoyed the meal. My stepmother complained bitterly about the cost, claiming that the whole situation could have been avoided if I'd just acted like family from the beginning. The irony of this statement wasn't lost on anyone. Looking back, I realized that walking away from that table was about more than just refusing to pay an outrageous bill. It was about finally refusing to accept a role that had been thrust upon me, rejecting the narrative that I was lucky to receive whatever scraps of affection and inclusion they were willing to offer. I spent years believing that if I just tried harder, if I was more accommodating and less demanding, I might eventually earn my place at the family table. But that night in the restaurant, I finally understood that the problem wasn't my worthiness, it was their willingness to treat me as worthy. The wobbly chair beside the trash can had been meant as a symbol of my place in the family hierarchy. Instead, it became the launching point for reclaiming my own dignity and self-respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, even when, especially when, it comes from the people who are supposed to love you most. My father and I still have a long way to go, and I'm not sure our relationship will ever be what it might have been under different circumstances. But for the first time in 15 years, I feel like I'm being seen as a person rather than an inconvenience. And that, more than any family dinner or birthday celebration, feels like something worth fighting for. The bill may have been $2,790, but the cost of my silence and compliance over the years had been far higher. Sometimes the most expensive lesson is the one that finally teaches you your own worth.